Fashion is dying. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the fashion is no longer exists sense, and not because people stopped caring about clothes. Fashion is dying because we've lost the art of curation. Somewhere between front row and the For You page, fashion has stopped being about garments and started becoming about content. And the weird thing is, fashion has never been more accessible. We can watch runway shows live from our phones. We can see collections before buyers even place orders. We can scroll through thousands of looks in a single night. But somehow, despite having more access than ever before, fashion feels emptier, faster, more disposable, less intentional. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because fashion used to feel like a world you entered. Now it feels like a feed you refresh. And maybe part of why this frustrates me so much is because I studied fashion during a period where social media completely transformed the industry in real time. I've seen how much labor goes into garments, how many fittings happen behind the scenes, how much emotional energy designers put into collections, how many unfinished ideas never make it even to the runway. And then you go online and realize most people experience all that work as background content while they're waiting for the next video to load. The disconnect is massive because fashion deserves to be experienced slower than the internet allows. And maybe that just sounds elitist, maybe it sounds nostalgic, but I generally think something important has been lost. So now I want to talk about it. Not just as someone who studied fashion, not just as someone who's worked backstage and inside these environments, but as someone who grew up loving fashion as culture, as fantasy, as storytelling, as identity. Because right now, fashion feels less like culture and more like content production. There was a time when fashion felt unreachable, and honestly, that was part of what made it powerful. In the 80s and 90s, fashion wasn't something you consumed every single second of the day. You couldn't open your phone and immediately see every collection from every angle. Runway shows were events, physical moments, experiences. And if you weren't invited in those spaces, you relied on magazines, newspaper spreads, television coverage, and word of mouth. There was a delay, a filter, a level of separation. And weirdly enough, that separation created imagination. People obsessed over editorials because they only saw them once a month. People studied garments because access was limited. Designers had time to develop worlds. Collections felt authored. Fashion wasn't operating at the speed of an algorithm. It operated at the speed of intention. And because of that, clothing carried more meaning. You can see in old runway footage, the pacing feels different, the audience feels present. The garments are the focus, not the reaction content, not the celebrity TikTok edits, not the get ready with me outside the venue. The clothes. And I think that limitation forced people to engage deeply, because when fashion wasn't constantly available, people developed personal style differently. You weren't being fed aesthetics every 3 seconds. You had to interpret the things yourself and apply them to your own world. Subcultures became stronger because people had to build identities physically, not based off an algorithm. You found references through music scenes, through local communities, through magazines, through nightlife, through experimentation. And because trends move slower, people had time to evolve. Now, an aesthetic can be born, it can peak, it can become commercialized and die within 3 weeks. And social media has completely accelerated that process. Social media didn't change fashion, it just changed how fashion functions. Because platforms like Instagram and TikTok don't reward depth, they reward speed, visibility, volume, engagement. The algorithm doesn't care if the garment took 6 months to develop. It cares where somebody watched the video for more than 8 seconds. And once fashion became dependent on engagement metrics, the priorities shifted. Designers became content creators, runway shows became marketing activations, collections became social media movements. And now every brand needs behind the scenes footage, campaign teasers, street style edits, influencer seeding, reaction clips, viral moments, micro content. Everything has to be documented instantly. Everything has to be optimized for attention. And eventually, the garment stops being the centerpiece. The content around the garment becomes the product. And that's the part I think people don't fully realize. Fashion today often feels less focused on creating lasting imagery and more focus on feeding the machine. And because everyone has access to fashion imagery now, we've created a kind of visual oversaturation. Nothing lasts, nothing settles. A collection can appear from public conversation and disappear from public conversation within 24 hours. Think about that. Entire collections, months of labor, pattern cutting, research, casting, fittings, textile development, creative direction, reduced to 15-second clips. And I don't think this is entirely the audience's fault. The platforms themselves are designed to encourage infinite consumption. Studies have shown that increased social media use is strongly linked to higher levels of fashion consumption, especially among younger audiences. There's been growing research about trend acceleration and digital overconsumptions. Some studies suggest platforms like TikTok and Instagram dramatically shorten the lifespan of trends, creating what researchers now describe as micro-trend cycles. And psychologically, that has consequences. Because when people are constantly exposed to new aesthetics, new products, and new identities online, it creates a pressure to continuously update the self, not your wardrobe, your entire image. Which explains why so many people feel visually exhausted right now. We're consuming more fashion imagery than any generation before us, but we're spending less time actually connecting to it. Because people aren't consuming clothes anymore, they're consuming aesthetics, identities, lifestyles. Fashion online has become deeply performative. People aren't always dressing for themselves, they're dressing for visibility, for documentation, for online recognition. And once clothing becomes content, repetition starts feeling like failure. You can't repeat the same outfit too many times because the internet already saw it. So the cycle speeds up. Buy, post, replace, repeat. And brands respond to that behavior by producing more, even more. More drops, more collaborations, more collections, more microtrends. Fashion no longer breathes, it just refreshes. And this is also where I think independent fashion has become trapped in the exact same system, which is difficult to talk about because I generally love seeing new brands emerge. I think fashion should evolve. I think young designers should experiment. I think grassroots labels are important. Some of the most exciting ideas in fashion historically came from people outside the system. But right now, a lot of emerging fashion feels less like design and more like content merchandising. And there's a difference between merch and fashion. Not because one is automatically superior, but because they come from different intentions. Fashion is world building, fashion is silhouette, construction, fabric, narrative, emotion, cultural content. Merchandise is often identity signaling, a logo, a slogan, a graphic, a singular moment. And increasingly, a lot of independent fashion online feels trapped in this endless cycle of graphic on a hoodie, graphic on a t-shirt, drop teaser, archive inspired campaign, sold out post, repeat. And again, I'm not saying every independent brand is doing this. There are still incredibly talented young designers making thoughtful work. But the internet rewards immediacy. It rewards brands that can manufacture attention quickly, not necessarily brands developing a long-term design language. So newer designers end up under pressure to become marketers before they even had time to become designers. And that creates a strange sameness. Everyone references the same aesthetics. Everyone references the same underground inspirations, the same 90s scans, the same distressed typography, the same washed out campaign styling, the same ironic branding. It almost feels like independent fashion has become trapped in an endless feedback loop of self-reference. And I think that part of that comes from social media collapsing the developmental process. In the past, brands had time to evolve identities slowly, to fail privately, to experiment, to refine. Now young creatives are expected to launch fully formed brands immediately. Perfect visuals, perfect campaigns, perfect social media strategy, perfect engagement. And because survival depends on visibility, people prioritize what's marketable before they prioritize mastery. That isn't entirely their fault. That's the system they inherited. But I do think we need to rebuild a culture that values refinement again, not perfection, refinement. The willingness to study garments deeply, to learn construction, to understand textiles, to develop perspective beyond aesthetics. Because fashion without substance eventually collapses into branding, and branding without substance fades quickly. Maybe that's why I feel so strongly about this, because I've seen firsthand how much work actually goes into developing a real collection. Studying fashion in a higher education completely changed how I understood clothing. People outside of those environments often only see the final outcome, the runway, the campaign, the finished garment. But they don't see the months of research beforehand. The references, the art history, the film studies, the cultural theory, the textile experimentation, the sketchbooks, the failed toiles, the pattern cutting, the fittings, the books, the essays, the visual research, the emotional burnout. You spend months trying to build a world around the single collection, trying to make garments communicate an idea, trying to develop something with depth. And that is why I think fashion and merchandise are often treated as the same thing online, when fundamentally they're not. Because putting a graphic on a t-shirt and developing a full realized collection are completely different creative processes. And again, that doesn't mean graphic design has no value. There's amazing and incredible graphic work out there, but the labor behind fashion design is often massively underestimated online. Sometimes I look at the current landscape and it feels like comparing somebody spending years painting a masterpiece to somebody typing out a prompt into an AI generator and calling the output equivalent. Both produce images, but the process, intention, and craftsmanship and depth behind them are fundamentally different. And I think social media has blurred those distinctions, because online everything comes flattened into content. A fully developed collection appears beside a cheaply produced trend piece, and both are consumed exactly at the same speed, which creates a culture where effort becomes increasingly invisible. And once effort becomes invisible, people stop valuing refinement, they stop valuing process, they stop valuing mastery. Everything becomes about immediacy instead. There's a reason the most influential designers still resonate decades later. It wasn't because they knew how to optimize content, it was because they had a point of view. And I think a lot of younger creatives actually want that depth, but they're creating inside of a system that constantly pushes them towards speed instead. When everything is trending, nothing is special. One of the strangest things about modern fashion is individuality has become constantly advertised, while everybody is becoming visually identical. And I think that contradiction comes from algorithms, because algorithms don't really encourage originality. They encourage familiarity. If a silhouette performs well online, you suddenly see hundreds of versions of it. If a certain aesthetic gets engagement, the entire internet starts reproducing it, and eventually personal style becomes less about self-expression and more about participation. You're not building a wardrobe, you're joining a visual conversation. And fashion has always involved trends, that's not new. But what's different now is the speed and intensity. Micro trends emerge almost weekly. People completely redesign their identities around aesthetics that appear within months. And because everyone is constantly consuming references, it becomes harder to tell where the originality even begins. We're living in an era of endless replication. Bootlegs on bootlegs, references of references, AI-generated interpretations of already existing aesthetics. And honestly, this is where I start thinking about fashion philosophically. Because if fashion becomes an infinite loop of recycled imagery, then what happens to authorship? What happens to authenticity? When everyone is referencing everyone else simultaneously, the line between original work and reproduced work starts collapsing. Fashion becomes self-referential. An image referencing another image referencing another image. And I think social media intensifies this because platforms flatten context. A runway collection from 1997 appears on the same feed as a Shein haul. An archival editorial appears between sponsored ads and AI-generated lookbooks. Everyone and everything becomes visually equalized, which does sound democratic on paper, but in practice it makes fashion feel emotionally weightless, because context matters, history matters, crafts matters, and the internet often strips those things away. I also think we underestimate how important mystery was to fashion. Not knowing everything made fashion exciting. Designers weren't constantly accessible. You didn't know every detail about every campaign before it launched. There was anticipation, speculation, distance. Now, everything is immediate. We see fittings before the show. We see the campaign before the campaign. We see the teaser before the teaser. The reaction before people have even processed the work. Fashion used to build worlds. Now it often feels like a live streaming production. And again, accessibility itself isn't inherently bad. I'm not saying fashion should go back to being just for the elite and the exclusive. But I do think constant exposure changes how people emotionally engage with art. When you see everything all the time, eventually nothing feels rare, and rarity creates emotional attachment. This is why people still romanticize old editorials, old runway footage, old campaigns, not because they were just visually strong, but because they felt like glimpses into another world. Fashion had atmosphere. Now the atmosphere is often replaced by optimization. What performs well, what gets clipped, what becomes memeable, what trends. And I think younger designers especially are now entering an industry where they're expected to be designers, editors, content creators, marketing teams, social media managers, personal brands, everything under the sun. And that pressure fundamentally changes the creative process. Because instead of asking, what do I want to say? People are increasingly asking, what will perform? And those are two very different questions. And now we're entering another phase entirely. Artificial intelligence, AI-generated campaigns, AI-generated models, AI-generated trend forecasting, AI-generated styling imagery. And what scares me isn't necessarily the technology itself, it's the possibility that fashion has become detached from physicality. Because fashion at its core is tactile. It's about fabric, movement, construction, texture, weight, imperfection. You fully can't understand a garment through a screen. And yet increasingly, fashion exists as digital imagery now. Something to scroll past, not something to physically experience. Even fashion shows now often feel designed for cameras before audiences. The audience online has become more important than the audience in the room. And maybe that's inevitable, maybe that's where culture has moved. But I still think there's something deeply human about the craftsmanship that can't be replicated through pure content production. People still crave authenticity. They still crave emotion. They still crave physical connection. And that's probably why archival fashion still resonates so strongly online, because people feel the intention behind it. The work feels lived in, specific, human. And that's why I think a lot of contemporary fashion imagery is missing. Humanity. Not polish, not access, not visibility. Humanity. So, is fashion actually dying? No, probably not. People will always care about clothes. People will always use fashion to communicate identity. People will always create. But I think a certain version of fashion is disappearing. A slower version, a more curated version, a version built around anticipation, craftsmanship, and cultural depth, rather than constant visibility. And maybe this isn't really about fashion at all. Maybe it happens when culture becomes content. Because once every creative industry becomes dependent on algorithms, engagement, and speed, depth becomes harder to sustain. And I think a lot of people can feel that, even if they can't fully articulate it yet. The exhaustion, the oversaturation, the feeling that we're constantly consuming imagery without actually connecting to it. Fashion used to feel aspirational because it created worlds. Now it often feels like we're trying to survive the attention economy. And maybe the future of fashion isn't about producing more. Maybe it's about slowing down and curating what we do. Creating less, curating better, allowing garments to exist beyond the lifespan of a trend cycle. Because if fashion becomes purely content driven, eventually the content consumes itself. And once that happens, what exactly are we left with?